Okay, and our fourth speaker this afternoon is Amy Kahng, who is a PhD candidate in art history and criticism at Stony Brook University. Her dissertation project examines 20th century Asian American artists who visualize land and landscape in their practices. Amy is a 2024-25 Tyson Scholar at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, and her research has been supported by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, the Graduate Council Fellowship at Stony Brook, and the Center for Korean Studies, also at Stony Brook. Amy is an independent curator and has contributed to projects at MoMA, MFA Boston, J. Paul Getty Museum, and the Paul Zuccher Gallery. Her talk today is entitled Unstable Ground: Juxtaposing Colonial Visions of Indigenous Land and Shifting Racial Conditionality in Shura Obata's Paintings of the American West. Please join me in welcoming Amy Kahng.
Thank you so much for that intro, and thank you everyone so much for joining me this afternoon. I really appreciate you all sticking around while you're probably dying of hunger. I really want to thank the conference organizers and also our wonderful chair, Emily Burns, who kindly let me join as a late addition. So I'll just get started. A row of crudely rendered barracks stands shakily at uneven levels. The dust and wind sway like topsy-turvy ocean waves, appearing to almost lift the shaky structures up with it. Titled Dust Storm Topaz, this watercolor on paper is one of dozens of landscapes Japanese-born painter Chihiro Obata completed while forcefully incarcerated by the US during World War II. Obata was a Japanese immigrant, a successful painter, and respected university professor. But in 1942, he was uprooted from his Bay Area community and, as this painting illustrates, quite literally lost any sense of stable ground. Obata's status of relative privilege in the United States was complex. He was an immigrant of color and a settler, and he achieved prestige and success in his professions, though the moderate level of privilege he experienced was in fact precariously contingent on when the state considered him a self-determining or criminalized entity. The artist's practice prior to incarceration reflected his relatively privileged and stable relationship to land, seen in this representation of El Capitan, and starkly contrasts with the paintings that he made while incarcerated, which center the built environment, harsh weather conditions, and destabilized landscape scenes. In this presentation, I outline Obata's relationship to and implication within multi-layered settler colonial gazes of the American West, gazes from the perspective of both Meiji Japan, his home country, and the United States. Throughout his career in the US, Obata's landscape paintings make evident his conditional racial positionality, as both a settler with an implicit claim to land as visualized in his idealized landscapes of California, and also as a ward of the state, incarcerated without access to land or property, but also in some ways as property of the US state himself. My paper contends with the physical and conceptual imbrication of these works within a complex web that entwines the racist policies that deprived Japanese Americans of their legal rights, the dispossession of indigenous land on Indian reservations, and Japanese and American colonial conquest in the long history of US settlement and into the 20th century. Born in 1885 in Okayama, Japan, Obata studied classical Sumi-e ink painting in his grade school years and proved to be a young art prodigy. Prior to his move to the US, the artist was implicated in the context of Japanese imperial pursuits. At 14 years old, Obata enrolled at the prestigious and government-operated Tokyo School of Fine Arts, which was the center of education for Nihonga, the recently established nationalistic painting style that was developed, funded, and promoted by the Japanese government. As art historian Chelsea Foxwell has described, Nihonga is a neo-traditional Japanese painting style used as a means of formalizing a national imperial identity on the international stage and resists the westernization of culture in Japan. Despite his success working in this nationalistic style, in 1903, at age 18, Obata left Japan and moved to San Francisco alongside a wave of hundreds of Japanese artists looking to expand artistic horizons. Like his artistic training, Obata's move to the US was reflective of and implicated within the imperial pursuits of the Meiji government. Specifically, his migration followed the widespread promotion of Japanese emigration to the United States, coinciding with pronounced national aspirations towards eastward expansion. Historian Eiichiro Azuma documents how Japan viewed the Western Hemisphere and the American West as an extension of their trans-Pacific imperialism, and gave nicknames to the American West such as New Japan and an imperial beginning. In fact, the term for emigrant and colonizer were often conflated or combined. Obata was indeed one of the many Japanese nationals, particularly intellectuals and students, who made their way to New Japan at a moment when the Japanese Meiji government sought to promote this type of soft colonization. Widely circulated government-sponsored travel guides also spoke of the, quote, great colonial land of California and encouraged Japanese people to plant new homelands. America is large, wealthy, and promising. The pioneer sentiments that permeated the Japanese discourses on America seem echoed in Obata's own decision to move to the US. Indeed, when asked why he moved to the US, Obata said, "I felt the world was too small. I wanted to see a bigger world, and that's why I wanted to go to America, because I wanted to come in contact with a larger, great nature." And the statement, which mirrors some of the colonial language espoused by Japan. Intentional or not, the artist's immigration to the US and early Nihonga training convey his complicity in contemporaneous Japanese imperial pursuits. Upon his arrival to the United States and engagement with the traditions of American landscape painting, Obata's practice then became likewise imbricated in another tool of settler colonialism, one that's activated by white settlers and advanced in the American landscape genre. Obata was not only situated in Japanese settlement of the US, but also alongside the American settlement across the Western US and its artistic representations. In the years after arriving in the US and into the 1920s, Obata frequently drew from his Nihonga training to capture American landscape scenes. These scenes share compositional similarities with the grand American landscape paintings and photos by figures like Albert Bierstadt, Thomas Moran, and Carlton Watkins made 3/4 of a century prior to Obata's. Not wholly dissimilar to Nihonga, many of the American landscape paintings and photographs were also government-sponsored, commissioned in the service of visualizing a unified national identity. In their legacy, they have become synonymous with the imperial agenda of Manifest Destiny. Still highly circulated in the 1920s, Obata would have seen works by these American artists exhibited at Bay Area institutions. The artist was also exposed to work from colleagues like Param Nall, Ray Boynton, and later Ansel Adams, who continued to engage in the lineage of this landscape genre. And it was through these Bay Area artist friends that Obata initially visited Yosemite and began his immensely iconic series, the World Landscape Series. In 1927, Obata began his series of acclaimed sketches and watercolor paintings from Yosemite and California more broadly. That year, Obata painted 150 watercolor sketches on his first visit to Yosemite during a highly influential 6-week sketching tour. In the year following his sketches, Obata returned to Japan to meticulously translate these watercolors into time-intensive progressive proof prints that comprise the World Landscape Series prints. These Yosemite compositions appear to draw from the best general view, which was established by Carlton Watkins and subsequently taken up by American landscape painters. Art historian Martin Berger describes the best general view as a compositional convention used by Euro-American artists and photographers focusing on a nearly identical set of characteristics, such as close-up compositions of monumental geographic features, as well as distant overviews that assume the ability to quantify and claim the landscape. Obata's depictions of these major sites of Yosemite align with the impulse to capture these, quote, best general views, as has been the tradition for 3/4 of a century. These views Obata captured share the sense of grandeur as well as the misleading representation of an uninhabited frontier landscape. Even though Obata was an immigrant of color, he adopted formal strategies in line with Manifest Destiny rubrics. His adopted colonial gaze aligns with how theorist Candice Fujikane would describe his positionality as a non-indigenous person and thus settler of color. Obata's participation in the settler gaze, as seen in his works from this period, which imply a familiar sense of access and entitlement to the land, and with it, the implied dispossession of indigenous people. More than implicit, however, Obata's trips to Yosemite can be directly connected to the expansion of American settlement and indigenous land dispossession in the 19th to 20th centuries. Though all national parklands were at one point inhabited by native populations, Yosemite is actually the only national park to have had active native inhabitants within its boundaries. During the years when the artist frequented the park, the Awanichi tribe continued to live within the borders of the designated national park until their final forced removal in the mid-20th century. Members of the Awanichi worked in the exploding tourism industry, and their culture became a tourist attraction that added to the draw of the park. In the era of Obata's visits to Yosemite, the Awanichi were actively working to adapt to, as well as resist, the American imperial conquests. Though I've not come across any direct evidence of their meeting, Obata likely would have encountered these populations. Obata's enjoyment of the federal parklands at Yosemite over the course of his career is evident in his World Landscape series, the success of which demonstrate how he profited from this access. The imagery of his World Landscape series would not have been possible without the then ongoing violent eviction of the Awanichi native communities over the course of a century. While enjoying the park as a settler of color, benefiting from the settler violence and the dispossession of indigenous land, nevertheless, Obata was an immigrant from Japan. He faced discrimination, both socially and legally, setting apart his relationship to the American landscape from his white counterparts. Less than 10 years after his arrival to the US, the 1913 Alien Land Law precluded the Japanese artist from land ownership. And a decade following, in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act barred any new immigration from Asia. Despite cultural and racial marginalization, Obata achieved a life of relative privilege and artistic success, holding solo exhibitions in the 1920s and 30s at institutions such as the Legion of Honor. Obata's paintings from this period reflect his own efforts to claim the land and make space for himself, even while facing legal discrimination and his own exclusion from accessing such ownership. After being situated in the Bay Area painting scene for nearly 3 decades, in 1932, Obata was hired at the prestigious University of California, Berkeley, as the first art faculty member of color. In 1942, Obata's time at Berkeley was violently interrupted as he was one of 120,000 Japanese Americans forcefully removed and incarcerated. He would return to his faculty position only years after the war concluded. Against his will, Obata was relocated 20 miles from his home in Oakland across the bay to Tanforan Assembly Center in April 1942, and again 700 miles east to Topaz Relocation Center in Utah in September of the same year. Historians of Japanese incarceration and indigenous histories in the US make evident the shared methods of removal and containment that the federal government used to control and surveil both Japanese Americans through wartime incarceration and Native communities through the reservation system a century prior. Though the Topaz Relocation Center, where Obata was incarcerated, was not directly built on an active Indian reservation, it was built on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ute Native tribe. And many of the similar camps were established unlawfully on Indian reservations, revealing the integral nature of land dispossession to the development of Japanese incarceration policy. Here we see a Pottstown Relocation Center established within the bounds of the Colorado River Indian Reservation. Additionally, one of the off-cited justifications for Japanese incarceration by war relocation agency administrators was that Japanese Americans were stereotypically known to be efficient and successful farmers, whereas Native people were comparatively doubted in their abilities to make their land productive and be productive members of society, racist claims used to further challenge their right to the land. Thus, it was considered advantageous to relocate the Japanese population to the so-called underutilized lands on Indian reservations to develop and improve the land for agriculture. The intrinsically and geographically linked history of Japanese incarceration and Indian reservations reveals the broader expansionist political context that his paintings reflect, and within which Obata and these paintings were implicated. While incarcerated at Tanforan and Topaz, Obata famously founded an art school with over 600 students. In addition to running the art school, the artist continued to paint landscapes of the American West, capturing desert scenes in Topaz, Utah. If Obata's paintings prior to his incarceration portrayed land as harmonious, utopic scenes of so-called great nature, these scenes are a stark departure, violently unsettled by structures that serve as markings of war and control. In this contrast, we can see how the perspective of the artist, previously a participant in the imperialist American landscape imaginary, became one of thousands of incarcerated people utilizing the American imperial agenda. Departing significantly from Obata's paintings prior to incarceration, this central subject is incompatible with the 19th century treatment of the space as empty, uninhabited landscape. In Sunset Water Tower, March 10, 1943, here, we see built structures now occupy the central focus of his landscape. The darkly pigmented, sharp lines of the water tower impede the natural and organic curve of the brilliant red and orange clouds that sweep off into the horizon. The built structure intersects the horizon line that would otherwise harmoniously ground the composition and breaks the rhythm of the rolling clouds, blue sky, and repeating snowy mountain peaks. The emphasis on the built environment is depicted from what must have been an imagined, distant viewpoint outside of the containment of the camp. Inescapable in the foreground are the cold, human-made features which draw the viewer's eyes to the center of the composition and prevent us from accessing the pristine landscape view typically offered by the genre. The landscape loses the stable horizon line and central focus on nature that's central to the American landscape imaginary. Instead, the imposing structures of confinement interrupt the continuity and tower over the natural scene. While Obata is framed by scholars as apolitical and generally reluctant to overtly contest the discriminatory practices of the War Relocation Agency, painting scenes of his incarceration and establishing an art school within the camp demonstrate his own mode of protest. His works speak to his intimate familiarity with the industrial structures and severe natural elements in which he and other Japanese Americans were forced to live. Further, the imposing and definitive presence of these structures in his work evidences Obata's understanding of their ideological and political origins as oppressive and disruptive. Returning to Dust Storm Topaz, from where I began this presentation, this painting emphasizes the harsh weather to further destabilize the landscape scene. Far from a crisp, aestheticized picture that celebrates California nature, this work presents an affective, sensory illustration of the staggering natural elements in life while incarcerated. The energetic, dusty sky is indiscriminate from the curving ground in gray and light brown that sways into dramatic peaks and valleys. Small figures make insufficient attempts to take cover. Their frantic, multi-directional movements echo the erratic gusts of wind. The shoddy barracks stand precariously, an unfair match against the turbulent weather. It's unclear where the ground ends and the sky begins. What had become a disrupted horizon line in Sunset Water Tower is now exaggerated into an ambiguous and destabilized scene in Dust Storm Topaz. While Obata centers the natural elements in this watercolor, he does so in service of emphasizing the material hardships of the inhabitants. Here, any sort of stable ground from Obata's early landscapes has completely disintegrated, mirroring the dramatic upheaval of a stable daily life and profession to becoming a criminalized and racialized entity. The seemingly futile battles with dust that are represented in Dust Storm Topaz is further illustrated in his diary sketch, Dust Storm in the Barracks. In a letter to friend Dorothy Parker, he describes the severe storms as, quote, so bad we couldn't see across the barracks. Revealed in these works is the dominance of the landscape over the camp's inhabitants, a very different picture from the once relatively stable claim to land that Obata had admired in his landscape painting. To conclude, examining Obata's works from prior to and during his incarceration bring to light his contingent racial positionality. As a settler colonial painter, claiming land in his idealized landscapes of California, and also as a ward of the state, incarcerated property of the U.S. state without access to land or property for himself. Obata's paintings from the first half of the 20th century reveal the evidence of Japanese and American colonial visions, while those from his incarceration disrupt conventions in the American landscape genre, both in its subject matter and compositional elements. Japanese Americans were already marginalized under alien land laws and the Alien Exclusion Act, Yet were further racially discriminated against and mobilized in an effort to justify and advance settler colonial claims to indigenous land via incarceration centers, and thus extend control over both populations. Investigating Obata's paintings from his incarceration allow us to further untangle the complicated, multifaceted, and contingent positionality of Asian Americans, particularly Japanese Americans, and the US cultural and racial makeup of the 20th century. Thank you.